They say true power is quiet. It doesn't need to shout to be heard, and it certainly doesn't need to perform for an audience. I'm sitting at a massive mahogany desk on the top floor of the Langford Enterprises building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretches out below me, bathed in the soft, fading light of late afternoon. Just moments ago, I signed a document authorizing a $40 million land acquisition. My hand didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I simply reviewed the structure of the deal, found it flawless, and signed. My name is Eleanor Langford. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. To understand how I ended up in the chairman's seat of a real estate empire, you have to understand the lengths my own family went to in order to keep me out of it. For 28 years, I was the ghost of the Langford family. I was the secret they couldn't entirely hide, but refused to acknowledge. The problem, according to my parents, began when I was 7 years old. That was the year I was officially diagnosed with severe dyslexia. To me, words on a page weren't obedient soldiers lined up in neat rows. They were a swarm of bees. They floated, rearranged themselves, and blurred together, turning even the simplest paragraphs into exhausting puzzles. In a different family, this might have been met with patience. Tutors might have been hired to help me find a new way to learn. But I wasn't born into a different family. I was born to Maximilian and Lavinia Langford. My father, Maximilian, was the CEO of Langford Enterprises. He was a man who measured human value strictly by return on investment. He didn't build the company, his mother did, but he wore the power as if he had forged it himself. To him, an heir with a learning disability wasn't a child needing support. It was a defective asset. It was an embarrassment. My mother, Lavinia, was the architect of our family's social facade. She spent her days curating our public image for the elite circles of the city. When the school psychologist explained my diagnosis, my mother didn't ask how to help me. She simply sighed, rubbed her temples as if I had given her a migraine, and asked how we were going to explain this to her friends. They decided the best way to handle my flaw was to sweep it under the rug. They stopped asking about my grades. They stopped expecting anything from me. I was quietly moved to the background, provided with a modest allowance, and left to raise myself in the shadows of our sprawling, cold estate. And all of their energy, all of their wealth, and all of their suffocating expectations were violently redirected toward my younger sister, Ophelia. Ophelia was the golden child. If I was the family's hidden shame, she was their crown jewel. She was brilliant, beautiful, and most importantly, she performed perfectly. By the time she was 12, she was fluent in 3 languages, played the cello at a concert level, and was being groomed for the Ivy League. While I spent my evenings alone in my room, teaching myself to process information through audiobooks and sketching out ideas, Ophelia was subjected to a grueling schedule of private tutors and social conditioning. I used to watch her through the crack in her bedroom door. She always looked so tired, her shoulders tense, reciting legal precedents to my father until past midnight. I used to be jealous of the attention she got. It took me years to realize that while being the discarded child is a lonely kind of trauma, being the golden child is just a different kind of cage. You are only loved as long as you are useful, and Ophelia was about to become very, very useful. What the public didn't know, what nobody knew except for a few terrified accountants, was that Langford Enterprises was quietly bleeding out. My father's arrogance had led him into a series of catastrophic commercial real estate investments. The foundation of the empire was cracking. To save his own skin, my father needed a massive injection of capital, and he found it in a rival billionaire family who just so happened to have an eligible son. Ophelia wasn't just graduating from law school that spring. She was being positioned as the ultimate bargaining chip. A brilliant, credentialed lawyer with a perfect pedigree, ready to be married off to merge 2 empires and save my father from absolute ruin. But to secure that deal, my father needed to prove to his new partners that his legacy was secure, pristine, and completely unburdened by weak links. And he needed to prove that his empire would be handed over seamlessly to his perfect daughter without any interference from his defective one. I just didn't realize he planned to use me as the sacrificial lamb to prove his point. Which brings us to the night of Ophelia's graduation gala. It was held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. 350 guests were invited. Politicians, judges, wealthy investors, and socialites filled the room, bathed in the warm, golden glow of crystal chandeliers. I stood near the entrance, pulling nervously at the sleeves of my dress. It was a simple, off-the-rack black dress I had bought myself. My mother had specifically instructed me not to wear anything too loud. Tonight is about your sister's flawless achievement, Lavinia had whispered to me in the hallway before we left the house, her manicured fingers adjusting her diamond necklace. Sit at the back. Don't speak unless spoken to. And for heaven's sake, if someone asks what you do, just say you work in administration. Don't embarrass us. I did work in administration, at Langford Enterprises, for a salary that barely covered my rent in a tiny apartment across the city, where I had moved to escape the suffocating air of my parents' house. My job consisted of making copies and filing contracts that no one thought I could read. What they didn't know was that my dyslexia had forced my brain to adapt in ways they couldn't comprehend. I couldn't read words quickly, but I could read structures instantly. When I looked at those contracts in the copy room, I saw blueprints. I saw how the clauses connected, where the money flowed, and where the fatal loopholes were hiding. I had an architect's mind, and I had been quietly mapping out my father's disastrous mistakes for 2 years. But standing in that glittering ballroom, ignored by passing waiters and distant relatives, I didn't feel like an architect. I felt like the same 7-year-old girl who couldn't read the board in class. I found my assigned seat at table 32, tucked away behind a massive floral arrangement near the kitchen doors. Far away from the main stage where my father was tapping a spoon against his crystal champagne glass, calling for the room's attention. The orchestra stopped playing. The low hum of elite conversation faded into a respectful silence. My father stepped up to the microphone, his charismatic smile firmly in place. Ophelia stood beside him, radiant in a designer silk gown, playing her part flawlessly. I watched him take a deep breath, preparing to deliver a speech that would change the trajectory of my life forever. I just didn't know it yet. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and friends, my father's voice echoed through the ballroom, rich and commanding. He gripped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of faces with the confidence of a king surveying his loyal subjects. Tonight, we gather to celebrate not just an academic milestone, but the dawn of a new era for Langford Enterprises. A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. At table 32, behind the floral arrangement, I folded my hands in my lap. My palms were sweating. Ophelia has graduated at the absolute top of her class from law school, he continued, turning to smile at my sister. The spotlight hit her perfectly, making the diamonds at her throat catch the light. But a brilliant mind is meant to build empires, not just study them. That is why, effective immediately, Ophelia will be joining Langford Enterprises as our Executive Vice President of Legal and Strategic Affairs. The room erupted into applause. It was an absurd title for a fresh graduate who had never negotiated a real contract in her life. But no one in that room cared about her lack of experience. They cared about the narrative. As the clapping subsided, my father raised a hand. His gaze drifted past the politicians and the socialites, settling deliberately on a table near the front. Seated there was the patriarch of a rival investment firm, a family with enough capital to drag Langford Enterprises out of the silent, crushing debt my father had buried it in. Sitting next to that patriarch was his son, the man Ophelia was meant to merge our family with. I watched the patriarch give my father a slow, approving nod. It was a silent transaction, a demand for proof that my father could be ruthless enough to protect their combined assets. My father turned back to the microphone. The charismatic warmth vanished from his voice, replaced by the sterile, clinical tone he used when firing executives. To secure a legacy, a company must be built on unwavering strength, my father said, his voice dropping an octave. It requires the courage to invest in our greatest assets and the resolve to sever ties with what holds us back. Sure, a strange, uncomfortable chill settled over the ballroom. People shifted in their velvet chairs. Many of you know I have another daughter, he said. My heart slammed against my ribs. 350 heads began to turn. They scanned the room, looking for me. My mother, seated at the head table, delicately picked up her wineglass and looked firmly at the tablecloth. She didn't flinch. She knew this was coming. Eleanor is here tonight, my father continued, his voice carrying effortlessly over the dead silence. And while we love her, we must be honest about reality. Eleanor has struggled her entire life. Her cognitive limitations have made it impossible for her to keep pace with the rigorous demands of our family's legacy. We have carried her for 28 years, hoping she would find her footing. She has not. I stopped breathing. The air in the ballroom felt thick, suffocating, like water filling my lungs. I stared at him, praying he would stop, praying it was a terrible joke. A true leader cannot let sentimentality jeopardize a corporate empire, my father declared, his eyes locking onto the wealthy investor at the front table. Therefore, as we transition into this new phase of Langford Enterprises with Ophelia at the helm, I am officially announcing that Eleanor will have no part in the company's future. She will not inherit voting shares. She will not hold any board position. And to help her finally learn the independence she so desperately needs, her employment in our administrative department is terminated, and all financial support will cease as of tomorrow. He didn't just fire me. He didn't just disinherit me. He erased me. He took my learning disability, the thing they had ignored and shamed me for in private, and weaponized it in front of the most powerful people in the city to prove his own ruthlessness to a business partner. I was the cost of his bailout. We wish Eleanor the best in finding a path suited to her capabilities, he finished smoothly. Now please, raise your glasses to Ophelia Langford, the sole future of our family. To Ophelia! The crowd echoed, though the cheer was noticeably hollower than before. Glasses clinked. The orchestra struck up a lively waltz, a jarring contrast to the absolute devastation ringing in my ears. At the head table, Ophelia smiled modestly and raised her glass. For a split second, her eyes met mine across the massive room. I looked for pity. I looked for shock. I looked for my sister. But all I saw was a flicker of relief. As long as I was the sacrifice, she was safe. As long as the spotlight of my father's cruelty was on me, it wasn't burning her. A woman sitting next to me at table 32, a distant cousin I hadn't seen in a decade, leaned away from me, her eyes wide with a mix of pity and morbid fascination. It was the look you give a car crash on the side of the highway. I had to get out. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the marble floor, but the sound was drowned out by the orchestra. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to walk. I didn't run. I refused to give my father the satisfaction of watching me break down. I kept my chin high, my eyes fixed on the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom. I walked past the whispers, past the sympathetic glances that felt worse than the insults, past my mother, who didn't even turn her head as I walked by. When I finally pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway of the hotel, the facade crumbled. I pressed my back against the cool wall, gasping for air, tears hot and thick spilling down my face. I gripped the fabric of my cheap black dress, feeling entirely, utterly worthless. My father had won. He had rewritten the truth, turning me into a useless burden in front of the entire world, and I had absolutely nothing to fight back with. I was broke, unemployed, and entirely alone, or so I thought. Miss Langford. The voice was deep, calm, and unexpectedly gentle. It didn't come from the ballroom. It came from the shadows near the coat check. I quickly wiped my face, trying to compose myself as an older man stepped into the soft light of the hallway sconces. He was wearing a tailored gray suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase. He had kind, intelligent eyes that stood in stark contrast to the sharks circling in the ballroom behind me. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "If you're looking for the Langford party, it's inside." "I know exactly where the party is," the man said softly. "But I didn't come for them. I came for you." He stopped a few feet away from me and offered a professional nod. "My name is Harrison Vance. I was your grandmother's personal attorney." I froze. My grandmother, Beatrice Sinclair, had passed away 3 years ago. She was the only person in the family who had ever sat with me, the only one who told me that seeing the world differently wasn't a curse but a gift. "My grandmother?" I echoed, confused. "She's been gone for years." "She has," Harrison Vance agreed, "but before she passed, she gave me very specific instructions. She told me to watch your father. She told me to wait for the exact moment he proved to the world exactly who he is, and the moment he tried to cast you aside." He unlatched his leather briefcase. The metallic click echoed loudly in the empty hallway. "She said that when that night finally happened, you would be ready." He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a heavy stamp of red wax. He held it out to me. "What is this?" I whispered, afraid to touch it. "This, Eleanor," Harrison Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register, "is your grandmother's real will. And it's going to tear your father's empire down to the studs." I stared at the thick, cream-colored envelope in Harrison Vance's outstretched hand. The red wax seal caught the dim light of the hallway. It looked incredibly heavy, like an anchor waiting to drag me under, or perhaps a lifeline meant to pull me out of the dark. My fingers were trembling so violently I had to use both hands to take it. The parchment was crisp. "My father has a will," I whispered, my voice barely working. "A will my grandmother signed years ago, leaving the voting shares to him. I saw it. He practically flaunted it." "He has a will," Harrison corrected gently, his gray eyes steady. "Dated a year before she passed. But Beatrice Sinclair was a brilliant woman, Eleanor. She saw the rot creeping into Langford Enterprises, and more importantly, she saw the cruelty creeping into your father. 6 months before she died, she called me to her hospital room. She revoked the old will and drafted this one." I looked down at the envelope. "Then why wait? Why hide it until now?" "Because," Harrison sighed, a sound of heavy, burdened history. "She knew that if she handed you the company while you still believed you were broken, your father would crush you. He would manipulate you into signing it away. She needed you to see him for exactly what he is. She told me, 'Harrison, wait until Maximilian publicly executes her worth. Wait until he leaves her with absolutely nothing. Only then will she be angry enough to realize she has everything.'" A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and stinging. My grandmother had known. She had seen the train wreck coming from miles away, and she had built me a lifeboat. "Open it," he urged softly. My thumbnail caught the edge of the wax seal. It snapped with a sharp, satisfying crack. Inside was a sheaf of legal documents. At first, my dyslexia flared under the adrenaline. The black ink swam on the page, the letters dancing and refusing to settle. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and forced my mind to do what it did best in the copy room. Don't read the words, read the structure. I let my eyes blur the paragraphs and focused on the headings, the bolded terms, the numbers. And there it was. "Do hereby bequeath 52% of all voting shares in Langford Enterprises and the controlling interest of the Sinclair Family Trust to my granddaughter, Eleanor Langford." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. 52%. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was absolute, unquestionable control. It was the entire empire, valued at tens of millions of dollars. Below the legal jargon, in my grandmother's elegant, sloping handwriting, was a personal addendum. The letters were perfectly spaced, as if she had written it specifically for my eyes to easily trace. "To my Eleanor, they will tell you that you are slow. They will tell you that you are a liability. But I have watched you. You do not look at a building and see the paint, you see the foundation. You have an architect's mind. Do not let people who only know how to decorate tell you how to build. Take back my company." A sob tore from my throat. For 28 years, I had been starving for a single drop of validation, begging my parents to see me, and all along my grandmother had seen me completely. But as I scanned down to the next page, a heavily bolded section caught my eye. "Wait," I said, my brow furrowing as I pieced the clause together. "Section 4, the contingency." Harrison nodded, his expression tightening. "The ultimatum." I read it aloud, stumbling slightly over the legal phrasing. "This transfer of controlling shares is strictly contingent upon Eleanor Langford formally requesting an emergency meeting of the board of directors within 72 hours of receiving this document. Should she fail to do so, this will is rendered entirely void and the assets will default to the previous arrangement." I looked up at Harrison, panic cold and sharp in my chest. 72 hours? Why would she do that? Why put a ticking clock on this? "Because she knew you, Eleanor," Harrison said, stepping closer, his tone firm but compassionate. "She knew that if she gave you unlimited time, the voices of your parents in your head would talk you out of it. You would convince yourself you weren't smart enough or brave enough. You would choose peace over justice. She gave you a deadline because she needed to force your hand. 72 hours to choose. Will you stay the victim they just declared you to be in that ballroom? Or will you be the architect she knew you were?" From inside the ballroom, a muffled roar of laughter and applause erupted. They were probably toasting to Ophelia again, toasting to my banishment. Harrison reached into his worn briefcase one last time. He pulled out a heavy, polished mahogany box with a small brass lock. He handed it to me. It weighed heavily in my arms. "What is this?" I asked. "A weapon," Harrison replied simply. 52% of the shares gets you a seat at the head of the table. But to survive the wolves sitting around it, to survive your father, you will need leverage. Beatrice spent her last months compiling exactly what you need to win the room. She said to open it when you're ready to fight. He reached into his pocket and handed me a pristine white business card. The clock started the moment you broke that wax seal, Eleanor. You have exactly 3 days to file the paperwork with my office to convene the board. Once you do, there is no going back. It will be war." He gave me a long, piercing look. "I suggest you go home and open that box." With a polite bow of his head, Harrison Vance turned and walked silently down the carpeted hallway, disappearing into the shadows of the hotel lobby. I stood alone in the corridor. In my left hand, the legal right to a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. In my right, a locked mahogany box. And behind those heavy brass doors, a family who thought they had just buried me alive. It is one thing to survive a toxic family. It is an entirely different, terrifying thing to stand up and dismantle the house they built. An hour later, I was sitting on the floor of my cramped, poorly lit apartment. The heater in the corner was clicking noisily, a sharp contrast to the soaring string quartet playing at my sister's gala. My cheap black dress was tossed over a chair. I was wearing an old oversized sweater, staring at the mahogany box sitting on my faded rug. The digital clock on my microwave glowed a neon green. 11:45 p.m. The first few hours were already gone. My father's cruel voice from the podium echoed in my mind. Eleanor has struggled her entire life. Cognitive limitations. Terminated. No part in the company's future. If I did nothing, by Monday morning, I would have to start looking for a minimum wage job to cover my rent. Ophelia would step into an executive suite she didn't earn, and my father would continue to run my grandmother's legacy into the ground to save his own ego. I took a deep breath, reaching out with shaking fingers. I didn't want to be invisible anymore. I touched the brass latch of the mahogany box and pushed it open. The brass latch of the mahogany box gave way with a soft metallic click. I lifted the heavy wooden lid. Instantly, the faint, familiar scent of dried lavender and old paper drifted into the stale air of my apartment. It was the scent of my grandmother's study. A wave of grief washed over me, sharp and sudden, but I blinked the tears away. I didn't have time to mourn. The digital clock on my microwave flipped to midnight. 72 hours was now 71 and a half. Inside the box, resting on a bed of dark velvet, were 3 things. A folded piece of heavy cardstock, an old tarnished skeleton key, and a sleek silver USB drive. I reached for the cardstock first. Unfolding it, I recognized my grandmother's immaculate, flowing script. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then Harrison has done his job, and your father has finally shown you the absolute depths of his hubris. I am so deeply sorry I could not be there to shield you from the humiliation I know he just put you through. But I am not writing this to comfort you. I am writing this to wake you up. For your entire life, Maximilian and Lavinia have told you that you are broken. They told you that your mind is a liability. It was easier for them to label you as slow than to admit they simply lacked the intelligence to understand how you see the world. But I understood. Plug in the drive, Eleanor. Look at what you've done. Look at what your father tried to bury. With all my love and all my faith, Grandma Beatrice." My brow furrowed. Look at what I've done. I had done nothing but make copies, fetch coffee, and organize files that no one ever read. My hands were shaking as I picked up the silver USB drive. I pulled my cheap, battered laptop onto the floor, the cooling fan whirring loudly as I plugged the drive into the port. A folder popped up on the screen, simply titled The Architect. I clicked it open. Inside were dozens of high-resolution scanned PDF files. The titles of the files were familiar. The Harbor Point Acquisition, the Midtown Zoning Contract, the Horizon Joint Venture. These were the massive multi-million-dollar deals my father had closed over the last 2 years, the deals that had supposedly cemented his reputation as a ruthless visionary. I opened the first file, the Horizon Joint Venture. It was a scan of a draft contract from 18 months ago. But as I scrolled down, my breath hitched in my throat. The margins of the contract were entirely covered in red ink, but it wasn't standard legal markup. There were no crossed-out words or rewritten sentences. Instead, there were diagrams, intricate flowcharts, connecting arrows mapping out how Clause 4(b) contradicted the financial liabilities hidden deep in Section 12. Little hand-drawn architectural boxes showing exactly how the financing structure would collapse like a house of cards if interest rates shifted even a fraction of a percent. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That was my handwriting. Those were my diagrams. When I was trapped in the suffocating boredom of the copy room trying to make sense of the endless pages I was forced to collate, my dyslexic brain couldn't read the dense legal jargon line by line. So I would take the discarded draft copies out of the recycling bin. I would spread them out on the floor during my lunch break, and I would draw. I mapped the contracts out as if they were blueprints for a building, testing the structural integrity of the words. Whenever I found a fatal flaw, a place where the building would collapse, I mapped it out in red ink. When I was done, I would just leave the marked up drafts in the outgoing trays, assuming the janitorial staff would eventually throw them away. I clicked frantically to the next file and then the next. Dozens of contracts, hundreds of my diagrams. And then I found a subfolder titled Internal Memos, Legal Department. I opened a memo dated shortly after I had marked up the Horizon contract. It was from Langford Enterprises' head of legal, addressed to my father, Maximilian. The memo read, "We have anonymously received a structural breakdown of the Horizon draft from the outgoing trays. The analysis is unorthodox, but brilliant." It exposed a massive liability loophole in the vendor agreement that would have cost us upwards of $12 million in the first quarter alone. We have amended the contract according to these diagrams. Please advise if you hired an outside risk assessment consultant, as we would like to formally retain them. Beneath that memo, my grandmother had attached a note of her own. Your father took the credit, Eleanor. He told the board he caught the errors himself. But I knew my granddaughter's handwriting. I paid the night security guard to collect your doodles from the copy room every week and bring them to me. Maximilian didn't build this empire. He has been recklessly gambling with it. And for the last 2 years, you, the daughter he just discarded in front of the city's elite, are the only reason this company hasn't gone completely bankrupt. You are the phantom architect keeping the roof from caving in. I sat back against my worn sofa, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the tears streaming down my face. But this time, I wasn't crying from pain. I wasn't crying from the humiliation of the ballroom. I was crying from the overwhelming, shattering relief of validation. I am not broken. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder, drowning out the voices of my parents that had haunted me for 2 decades. The gaslighting was over. They hadn't hidden me away because I was useless. They had hidden me away because my father was a fraud, and my mind was the only thing capable of exposing him. He called me cognitively limited to cover up his own incompetence. I looked over at the cheap black dress thrown over the chair. I thought about Ophelia, wearing her diamonds, smiling as my father fed me to the wolves to secure a bailout marriage. I thought about my mother, looking at the tablecloth, choosing her social standing over her own child. Something inside me snapped. The frightened, neglected 7-year-old girl who just wanted to be loved finally went quiet, and in her place the architect woke up. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve. The sadness evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and perfectly structured anger. 52%. That was what my grandmother had left me. The power to fire the CEO, the power to dismantle the board, the power to take back the legacy that had been stolen from me. But Harrison Vance was right. Walking into the boardroom with just a piece of paper wouldn't be enough. My father was a cornered animal. He would fight dirty. He would claim I forged the will. He would claim my grandmother was out of her mind. I needed leverage, and I needed an ally on the inside to open the door for me. I glanced at the microwave clock. 1:30 a.m. 67 hours left. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the contact list. I scrolled past my mother, past Ophelia, past the Langford Enterprises main directory, until I found the name I was looking for. Catherine Sterling. She was the oldest sitting member of the board of directors, a fiercely intelligent woman who had been my grandmother's closest friend and fiercest ally. Catherine despised my father's flashy, reckless management style, but she had never had the voting power to stop him. Until now. I drafted a text message. I didn't apologize for the late hour. I didn't ask politely for her time. I wrote with the authority of a majority shareholder. Catherine. It's Eleanor Langford. I have Beatrice's real will, and I have the proof of who has actually been saving Maximilian's contracts for the last 2 years. I need to see you. Now. I hit send. 3 minutes later, my phone lit up with a reply. I've been waiting for this text for 3 years. Meet me at my townhouse in 30 minutes. Bring everything. I closed the laptop, slipped the USB drive into my pocket, and picked up the heavy mahogany box. I was done being the family's ghost. It was time to haunt them. The rain had started to fall by the time my cab pulled up to the wrought iron gates of Catherine Sterling's Upper East Side townhouse. It was a historic, understated limestone building. Unlike my father, who coated everything in gold leaf and marble to scream about his wealth, Catherine's power was quiet, old, and completely unshakable. She was waiting for me in her study. At 2 in the morning, Catherine was fully dressed in tailored wool slacks and a crisp white blouse, a glass of amber scotch resting on the desk beside her. She was 70 years old, with sharp cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, and hair the color of brushed steel. She had built her own fortune in commercial banking before joining the Langford board, and she suffered fools poorly. My father was, in her eyes, the ultimate fool. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a heavy leather chair opposite her desk. She didn't offer me a drink. She didn't offer fake sympathy about the gala. "Show me." I placed the cream-colored envelope on the desk. Next to it, I set my laptop and plugged in the silver USB drive. Catherine put on her reading glasses. The room was dead silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. For 10 agonizing minutes, she read the will. Then she turned her attention to the laptop screen, scrolling through the PDFs of my marked-up contracts and the memos from the legal department. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, suddenly feeling like an imposter. What if she laughed? What if she told me I was delusional to think I could take on the CEO of Langford Enterprises? Instead, Catherine slowly took off her glasses, folded them, and looked at me. There was a fierce, almost terrifying pride in her eyes. "I always knew Maximilian was arrogant," she said, her voice a low, raspy purr, "but I didn't realize he was a plagiarist. Beatrice told me you had a gift, Eleanor. She said you saw the bones of a building while everyone else was staring at the wallpaper. I see it now." She tapped a manicured finger against the laptop screen. "This diagram you drew on the Horizon contract, that saved the company from a $12 million default. Your father strutted into the boardroom the next week, claiming he had pulled an all-nighter to find the loophole himself. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. He told me tonight that I had cognitive limitations, in front of 300 people. "Of course he did," Catherine said smoothly, taking a sip of her scotch. "Narcissists always project their deepest insecurities onto their most threatening targets. He knows he's drowning. He's trying to merge with the Vanguard Group through Ophelia's marriage because our debt-to-income ratio is in free fall. If he didn't publicly cut you off, the Vanguards might have looked into why the defective daughter was still hanging around. He was covering his tracks." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "So, you have 52%. You have the intellect, but you have less than 65 hours left on Beatrice's clock. What is your move, Eleanor?" "I need to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But according to the corporate bylaws I read in the copy room, a majority shareholder cannot unilaterally convene the board without a formal petition signed by 2 sitting directors." Catherine smiled. It was a predatory, brilliant smile. "Exactly. You need 2 signatures. I am one." "Who is the second?" I asked. "Julian Hayes," she replied without hesitation. I frowned. Julian Hayes was the youngest member of the board, a slick, aggressive venture capitalist who always agreed with my father. "Julian? He's my father's biggest ally." "Julian Hayes is an ally to money, Eleanor," Catherine corrected sharply. "He doesn't care about your father. He cares about his portfolio. Julian has been growing suspicious of Maximilian's erratic behavior for months. If I go to him tonight, show him a redacted version of this will, and prove that a new majority shareholder is about to gut the executive suite, he will sign the petition, not out of loyalty to you, but to guarantee he is on the winning side of the coup." She paused, her blue eyes narrowing. "But listen to me very carefully. Julian is a snake. We use his signature to get you into that room, but you never, ever trust him. The moment he thinks you are weak, he will try to rip the company from your hands." "I understand," I said, and I did. I was done expecting loyalty from people incapable of it. "Good." Catherine stood up, walking over to a heavy mahogany wardrobe in the corner of her study. She opened it and pulled out a stunning structured charcoal gray blazer. It was vintage, impeccably tailored, with sharp, authoritative shoulders. She walked back and draped it over the back of my chair. "Your grandmother left this at my house the winter before she died," Catherine said softly. "She was a formidable woman, Eleanor. When she walked into a room, the temperature dropped. She didn't ask for respect. She commanded it. Tomorrow morning, when the petition hits your father's desk, he is going to panic. He will call you. He will threaten you. He might even send your mother to manipulate you." I looked at the blazer, tracing the fine wool with my fingertips. "Let them panic," Catherine continued. "You do not answer their calls. You do not explain yourself. You file the paperwork with Harrison Vance, and you wait for the clock to strike. Are you ready to ruin him, Eleanor? Because he will not step down quietly. He will try to destroy your character. I stood up, slipping my arms into my grandmother's blazer. It fit perfectly. The cheap, flimsy fabric of my oversized sweater was hidden beneath the heavy, impenetrable armor of Beatrice Sinclair. I looked Catherine Sterling dead in the eye. He already destroyed my character tonight, I said, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute certainty. He fired all his ammunition. He has nothing left to shoot me with. The next 36 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. True to her word, Catherine secured Julian Hayes' signature by dawn. By 9 a.m., the next day, Harrison Vance had formally filed the emergency petition with Langford Enterprises' legal department. The notification hit my father's desk at 9:15 a.m. At 9:20 a.m., my phone started ringing. Maximilian Langford. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, Lavinia Langford. I flipped the phone face down. By the afternoon, Ophelia was sending frantic, venomous text messages. What kind of stunt are you pulling? Dad is furious. You are making a fool of yourself. Call me back immediately. I deleted the thread without replying. For the first time in 28 years, I was the one holding the silence. And silence, I was quickly learning, was the most terrifying weapon you could use against people who are used to controlling the narrative. The morning of the board meeting arrived crisp and clear. The emergency session was scheduled for 10 a.m. on the 42nd floor of the Langford Tower. At 9:45 a.m., I stepped out of a black town car onto the bustling Manhattan pavement. I was wearing my grandmother's charcoal blazer, a tailored black skirt, and heels that clicked with sharp, measured precision against the marble floor of the lobby. The security guard at the front desk, a man named Thomas who had ignored me every day for 2 years while I carried boxes of paper past his station, stepped into my path. He looked at his tablet, frowning. "Miss Langford," he said, his tone dripping with practiced condescension, "your employee badge was deactivated on Sunday, and you aren't on the authorized visitor list for the executive floor." I didn't shrink back. I didn't stammer. I looked at Thomas, recognizing the exact brand of corporate bullying my father had trained his staff to use. "I'm not a visitor, Thomas," I said smoothly, not breaking eye contact. Before he could argue, the private executive elevator dinged. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing Catherine Sterling. She stepped out, her presence instantly silencing the bustling lobby. "She is with me," Catherine said, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "And if you ever attempt to block the majority shareholder of this company from entering her own building again, you will be clearing out your locker before lunch. Step aside." Thomas swallowed hard, his face draining of color. He took 2 quick steps backward. I walked past him without a second glance, stepping into the glass elevator beside Catherine. As the doors slid shut, sealing us in, my stomach did a slow, nervous flip, but my hands weren't shaking. "They're all up there," Catherine noted quietly as the elevator shot upward, the city shrinking beneath us. "Maximilian, Ophelia, and the corporate council. They think you're coming to beg for your administrative job back." I watched the floor numbers tick higher and higher, 40, 41, 42. "Let them think that," I replied, adjusting the cuffs of my grandmother's blazer. "It will make the impact that much harder." The elevator chimed. The doors opened. It was time for war. The double oak doors of the 42nd floor boardroom were heavy, but Catherine pushed them open without breaking stride. The room was vast, dominated by a polished walnut table that seemed to stretch on forever. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, casting a harsh, unforgiving morning light across the 12 people seated in the high-backed leather chairs. At the head of the table sat my father, Maximilian Langford. He was mid-sentence, gesturing animatedly with an expensive silver pen. To his immediate right sat Ophelia, looking immaculately polished in a cream-colored power suit, her hands folded primly on a fresh legal pad. Next to her sat the corporate council, and down the line were the rest of the board members, including Julian Hayes, who was tapping his phone with bored impatience. The heavy thud of the oak doors closing behind us cut my father off mid-word. Every head turned. For a fraction of a second, absolute silence swallowed the room. Then, my father's face hardened into a mask of furious disbelief. He threw his silver pen onto the table. It clattered loudly against the wood. "Catherine," my father said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "What is the meaning of this? And why did you bring her in here? Eleanor's employment was terminated 48 hours ago." Ophelia leaned forward, a perfectly practiced look of sisterly concern washing over her face. "Eleanor, please," she murmured, loud enough for the entire board to hear. "This is highly inappropriate. If you're upset about the gala or if you need help looking for a new administrative role, we can talk at home. Don't embarrass yourself in front of the board." I didn't shrink. I didn't look down. I felt the weight of my grandmother's charcoal blazer on my shoulders, and I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the empty chair at the opposite end of the long table. "I am not here for a job interview, Ophelia," I said. My voice was calm. It didn't shake. It resonated through the large room with a quiet, icy authority that I had never heard from myself before. "And I don't live at your home anymore." I reached the end of the table. I didn't sit down. I remained standing, resting my fingertips lightly on the polished walnut. Catherine took her seat smoothly on my left. "Mr. Chairman," Catherine addressed the room, her tone strictly procedural. "I, along with Mr. Hayes, filed an emergency petition this morning to convene this board. The floor belongs to the petitioner." My father stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "I am the CEO of Langford Enterprises, and I will not have my time wasted by a disgruntled former secretary who couldn't even manage the copy room. Security... I strongly suggest you sit down, Maximilian," a new voice echoed from the doorway. Harrison Vance stepped into the boardroom, his worn leather briefcase in hand. He walked past my father with the quiet dignity of a man who held all the cards and took his place standing just behind my right shoulder. "Mr. Vance," the corporate counsel stammered, adjusting his glasses nervously, "you no longer represent this company. Your firm's retainer was severed after Beatrice Sinclair's passing." "I am not here representing the company," Harrison replied smoothly. He unlatched his briefcase. "I am here representing the majority shareholder of Langford Enterprises." Harrison pulled the cream-colored envelope from his bag and slid it across the long table. It stopped precisely in front of the corporate counsel. "You are looking at the final, authenticated will and testament of Beatrice Sinclair," Harrison announced to the dead-silent room, "executed 6 months prior to her death, superseding all previous documents. It leaves 52% of all voting shares and absolute controlling interest of the Sinclair Family Trust to her granddaughter, Eleanor Langford." Ophelia let out a sharp, breathless gasp. My father gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. "That is a lie! That is a blatant, pathetic forgery! My mother left the voting shares to me. I have the documents." "You have an outdated draft, Maximilian?" Catherine cut in, swirling the water in her glass. "Beatrice knew you were running this company into the ground. She knew you were reckless. She left the keys to the only person in this family who actually understands how to build a foundation." "She is cognitively impaired," my father roared, pointing a trembling finger at me, completely abandoning his polished CEO persona. "Look at her. She can barely read a legal brief. She has severe dyslexia. She is entirely unfit to make a single decision for a multi-million-dollar corporation. I will tie this up in probate court for the next decade. I will have her declared legally incompetent." The board members shifted uncomfortably. Julian Hayes leaned forward, his predatory eyes darting between my furious father and my entirely composed face. I let my father's words hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. I let everyone in the room absorb his cruelty. Then I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the silver USB drive. I placed it gently on the table. "You want to talk about cognitive limitations, Maximilian?" I asked softly. I didn't call him Dad, not ever again. "Let's talk about them. Let's talk about the Horizon joint venture. Let's talk about the Midtown zoning contract. Both drafted by you. Both containing fatal liability loopholes that would have bankrupted this firm." My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "If you plug that drive into the projector," I continued, projecting my voice to the far corners of the room, "you will see every single draft contract from the last 2 years meticulously corrected and structurally re-engineered to save this company millions of dollars. You took the credit for them, but the handwriting in the margins is mine. The corporate counsel's internal memos confirm it. I have been doing your job from the copy room, Maximilian, and Beatrice knew." The corporate counsel stared at the silver drive as if it were an unexploded bomb. "But since we are on the topic of being unfit to manage a company," I said, turning my gaze slowly toward Ophelia. Ophelia froze. The color drained completely from her flawless face. "Let's talk about the golden child," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow sounded louder than a scream. Let's talk about the Executive Vice President of Legal and Strategic Affairs. I opened the leather folder I had brought with me and pulled out a stack of documents I had found in the mahogany box. Beatrice hadn't just collected my drawings. She had collected my father's secrets. Ophelia Langford, I read aloud, sliding the top paper down the table, did not graduate at the top of her class. In fact, she failed the state bar exam twice. The boardroom erupted into frantic murmurs. "That's private information!" Ophelia shrieked, her carefully curated mask completely shattering. She stood up, knocking her chair backward. "You have no right!" "I have every right!" I fired back, my voice finally rising, cracking like a whip across the room. Because according to these bank transfers, Maximilian used $800,000 of Langford Enterprises corporate funds to quietly pay off Ophelia's massive offshore gambling debts to ensure her background check remained clean for the Vanguard Group merger. Dead silence fell over the room again. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet. Embezzlement. It was the one word that terrified a board of directors more than anything else. Julian Hayes sat back in his chair, pressing his fingertips together. He didn't look at my father with loyalty anymore. He looked at him like a dead man walking. My father was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for a lifeline. But the faces of the board members had turned to stone. They were looking at the bank transfer documents now circulating the table. "You set me up," my father hissed at me, his voice a venomous whisper. "You ungrateful, scheming—" "I didn't set you up," I replied, staring directly into the eyes of the man who had tried to erase my existence. "I am just reading the blueprints of what you built, and structurally, Maximilian, you are collapsing." I turned my attention to the center of the table, addressing the room at large. "As the majority shareholder holding 52% of the voting rights, I am formally submitting a motion," I declared. "I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in the Chief Executive Officer, Maximilian Langford, and I am calling for an immediate audit of all executive accounts." "Seconded," Catherine Sterling said instantly, raising her hand. The corporate counsel wiped sweat from his brow. "A motion of no confidence has been called and seconded. All those in favor?" Catherine's hand remained high. Two other older board members, loyalists to my grandmother who had been disgusted by the embezzlement proof, raised their hands. My father looked desperately at Julian Hayes. "Julian," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Julian, we have a merger on the table. We have the Vanguard deal. You know what I can do for you." Julian Hayes looked at my father, then he looked at the irrefutable proof of corporate fraud lying on the table. Finally, he looked down the length of the walnut table at me. He recognized where the true power now sat. Julian slowly, deliberately raised his hand. One by one, the rest of the board followed. It was unanimous. "The motion passes," the corporate counsel whispered, his voice trembling. "Maximilian Langford is effectively removed as CEO, pending a full internal investigation." My father collapsed into his chair. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Ophelia was openly weeping, her face buried in her hands, her title and her perfect future entirely destroyed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply walked down the length of the long boardroom table. The board members parted for me, pulling their chairs in. I stopped beside my father's chair. He didn't look up at me. "Security," I said clearly, looking at the guards standing outside the glass walls of the boardroom. They stepped inside immediately. "Please escort Mr. Langford and his daughter off the premises," I instructed. "Their badges have been deactivated." As the guards gently but firmly pulled my father from the leather chair he had occupied for a decade, I took a step forward. I placed my hands on the high back of the chairman's seat at the head of the table. The room watched me in stunned, reverent silence. I took my seat. "Now," I said, looking at the faces of the board members who had survived the slaughter, "let's get to work. We have a company to rebuild." But yeah. The first 48 hours after the boardroom slaughter were not a victory lap. They were a rapid, brutal descent into the trenches. If taking the throne was a matter of pulling a sword from a stone, wearing the crown was like carrying the stone itself on your back. I moved into the executive suite on the 42nd floor, the very room my father had occupied for over a decade. The first thing I did was order building maintenance to remove his massive, ostentatious oil portrait from the wall behind the desk. It left a faded, rectangular shadow on the silk wallpaper, a constant looming reminder of the ghost I had just evicted. I didn't sit in his imported Italian leather chair. I couldn't stomach it. Instead, I pulled up a simple, ergonomic mesh chair from one of the junior executive cubicles. Sitting behind that desk, staring out at the sprawling, indifferent concrete jungle of Manhattan, the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation finally evaporated. In its place, a crushing, terrifying reality settled over my shoulders. Langford Enterprises was not the impenetrable fortress my father had pretended it to be. It was a rotting house of cards held together by nothing but his sheer audacity, fraudulent accounting, and the desperate hope of the Vanguard Group merger. To the public, the transition was framed as a strategic restructuring. Harrison Vance and the PR team worked around the clock to draft press releases that painted my father's sudden departure as an early retirement due to health concerns, and my ascension as the activation of Beatrice Sinclair's long-term succession plan. The market barely rippled. The stock price dipped a fraction of a percent and stabilized. But inside the walls of the tower, it was a war zone. The middle management, men and women who owed their lucrative careers to my father's culture of sycophancy, viewed me with open, undisguised hostility. To them, I wasn't the rightful heir or the savior of the company. I was still the slow daughter from the copy room who had somehow managed to execute a hostile, illegitimate coup. They dragged their feet on my requests. Files mysteriously went missing. Urgent emails were conveniently routed to spam folders. I didn't have time to play corporate politics, and I certainly didn't have time to hold their hands. I had to stop the bleeding. For 2 straight weeks, I barely slept. I lived in the office, ordering takeout that grew cold on my desk while I waded through the true extent of my father's financial sabotage. My dyslexia, which had once been my greatest source of shame, became my only weapon of survival. The numbers on the balance sheets didn't make sense linearly, so I didn't read them linearly. I ordered the IT department to install massive floor-to-ceiling glass whiteboards across the entire length of the executive suite. Armed with a dozen dry erase markers, I began to draw the company. I mapped out the subsidiaries, the shell corporations my father had used to hide bad debt, the inflated vendor contracts, and the bloated executive expense accounts. I drew lines connecting the unpaid contractors to the offshore accounts Ophelia had used to drain our liquid assets. I turned the incomprehensible legal jargon of our outstanding loans into massive, interconnected architectural structures on the glass. Slowly, the invisible rot became visible. I could see the exact pressure points where the company was about to collapse. At 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, Catherine Sterling walked into my office. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the chaotic symphony of red, blue, and black diagrams covering the glass walls. I was standing on a chair, crossing out a fraudulent consulting retainer my father had kept on the payroll. "You look like a beautiful, terrifying mad scientist, Eleanor," Catherine said, her voice dry but laced with genuine respect. She set a paper cup of black coffee on my desk. "Or a demolition expert." "Both, I think," I replied, stepping down from the chair and rubbing my exhausted eyes. He was drowning, Catherine. The Vanguard merger wasn't just a business move. It was a life raft. We have a $50 million balloon payment due to Chase Manhattan in 40 days on the Midtown project, and our liquid cash reserves are barely a quarter of that. He was going to use Ophelia's dowry, the merger capital, to pay the bank. Catherine's expression darkened. She walked over to the glass wall, studying the intricate web of debt I had drawn. And now the Vanguard merger is dead in the water. They pulled out the minute the news of Maximilian's retirement hit their desks. They wanted to marry into stability, not a boardroom bloody coup. Which means we have 39 days to find $35 million, or Langford Enterprises defaults, the stock tanks, and the board will have every right to vote me out for gross incompetence, I concluded, the bitter taste of reality heavy on my tongue. "You will find a way," Catherine said firmly, turning to look at me. "You are Beatrice's granddaughter. You see the exits no one else knows are there." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But finding the money is only half your problem, Eleanor. The wolves are not gone. They are just learning to hunt quieter." "Julian Hayes," I guessed, leaning against my desk. "Julian Hayes," Catherine confirmed. "He voted with us to save his own skin, but he despises you. He is a venture capitalist who thrives on distressed assets. He doesn't want Langford Enterprises to stabilize under your leadership. He wants it to bleed just enough so that he and his private equity friends can swoop in, buy the majority shares for pennies on the dollar, and dismantle your grandmother's legacy for parts. Watch your back. He is smiling in the boardroom, but he has a knife aimed precisely at your spine. I nodded slowly, the exhaustion momentarily pushed aside by a cold wave of vigilance. Let him trier. What neither Catherine nor I knew at that exact moment was that Julian Hayes wasn't just aiming the knife. He was already thrusting it. Across the city, in the dimly lit, smoke-filled corner of an exclusive, members-only cigar lounge in Tribeca, Julian Hayes was swirling a glass of 20-year-old bourbon. Sitting across from him in the leather booth was my father. Maximilian Langford looked nothing like the untouchable corporate king who had stood at the podium just weeks prior. His expensive suit looked slightly disheveled. The charismatic arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a frantic, hollow desperation. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was still waiting to hit the ground. "You betrayed me, Julian," my father hissed, his voice low and vibrating with venom. "I brought you onto that board. I made you, and you raised your hand to cast me out for that defective little copy girl." Julian didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. "I didn't betray you, Max. You betrayed yourself. You got caught embezzling funds to cover Ophelia's gambling debts. You handed your estranged daughter a loaded gun and practically begged her to pull the trigger. I simply stepped out of the bullet's path." My father clenched his jaw, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his own drink. "She can't run the company. She doesn't have the temperament, the connections, or the intellect. She's tracing shapes on a whiteboard right now, pretending she knows what a collateralized debt obligation is. The banks will eat her alive." "I agree," Julian said smoothly, leaning forward, the predatory gleam in his eyes cutting through the cigar smoke. "Eleanor is a temporary inconvenience, a glitch in the system. But right now, she holds 52% of the voting power. We cannot vote her out legally as long as the company is stable." "It's not stable," my father sneered. "The Chase Manhattan balloon payment is due next month. I know the books, Julian. I hid the bodies. She doesn't have the cash to cover it." "She is smarter than you think, Max. If she liquidates the Horizon assets, she might just scrape the capital together to make the payment and secure her throne for good," Julian countered smoothly. "We cannot leave this to chance. We need to manufacture a crisis so catastrophic, so public, that the shareholders will demand her head on a spike. We need to prove to the world that her cognitive limitations are an active danger to the market." My father's eyes narrowed, a desperate spark of hope igniting in the darkness of his ruin. "What do you need from me?" Julian set his glass down. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a slim, encrypted flash drive, sliding it across the polished mahogany table. "You still have contacts at the municipal zoning office, don't you? The ones you used to fast-track the permits for the waterfront development?" Julian asked softly. My father nodded slowly. "I need you to call in a favor," Julian instructed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I need you to have the city unexpectedly revoke the environmental permits for the waterfront project tomorrow morning. Claim a sudden discrepancy in the soil testing. Claim whatever you want, just shut the site down." My father frowned. "If we shut down the waterfront site, the union workers walk off. The investors will panic. The stock will plummet." "Exactly," Julian smiled, a cold reptilian curving of his lips. "It will be a media nightmare. The press will smell blood in the water. They will report that the new, inexperienced CEO is instantly destroying Langford's flagship projects. The stock will take a massive hit." Julian leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "And when the stock bottoms out and the board is in a state of absolute panic, I will step in. I will offer to buy out Eleanor's 52% at a deeply distressed valuation to save the company from bankruptcy. She will be so terrified and overwhelmed by the media storm, she will sign it away just to escape the humiliation." "And what about me?" my father demanded, his pride still fighting through his desperation. "Once I hold the controlling interest, I will restructure the board," Julian promised, his eyes devoid of any actual loyalty. "I will bring you back as a senior executive consultant to appease your old allies. We divide the empire, and we send Eleanor back to a minimum wage apartment where she belongs. Are we aligned, Max?" My father looked at the flash drive on the table. It was treason. It was actively destroying the company his mother had built just to punish the daughter he couldn't control. But for a man like Maximilian Langford, power was the only religion that mattered. He reached out and closed his hand over the flash drive. "Consider the permits revoked." The trap was set. While I was standing in my glass office, desperately trying to build a bridge to save my family's legacy, my own father and my supposed board member were busy planting dynamite at the foundation. The crown was heavy, yes, but the real danger wasn't the weight of the crown. It was the people standing behind you, waiting for your neck to snap. The storm did not arrive with a clap of thunder. It arrived with the relentless, terrifying ringing of every phone on the 42nd floor. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Thursday. I was already at my desk, a cold cup of coffee in hand, staring at the glass whiteboards that mapped the survival of Langford Enterprises. We were making progress. I had found a way to liquidate 2 underperforming shell companies to cover a third of the Chase Manhattan balloon payment. We just needed time. But time was the one thing Julian Hayes and my father had decided I would not have. Catherine Sterling burst through my office doors without knocking. In the 3 weeks I had worked alongside her, I had never seen her look anything less than perfectly composed. Today, her jaw was tight, and she was holding an iPad with white-knuckled grip. "Turn on the television, Eleanor," Catherine ordered, her voice completely stripped of its usual dry humor. "Channel 4, Financial Morning News, now." I grabbed the remote and unmuted the massive flat screen mounted on the far wall. The bright red ticker tape at the bottom of the screen caught my eye first, moving at a frantic pace. Langford Enterprises stock plummets 12% in pre-market trading. My stomach dropped into a bottomless freefall. On the screen, a polished financial anchor was speaking with grave urgency. Breaking news this morning out of the real estate sector. The city's municipal zoning office has abruptly revoked all environmental and structural permits for the Langford waterfront development, the company's flagship billion-dollar project. Union workers have been turned away at the gates and construction is indefinitely halted. "The permits?" I whispered, stepping toward the screen. "That's impossible. I reviewed the waterfront filings last week. They were flawless. We passed every soil and environmental benchmark." "It gets worse," Catherine said grimly, stepping up beside me. The news anchor's expression shifted from serious to sensational. "This catastrophic shutdown comes just weeks after a shocking, unannounced change in Langford's leadership. Maximilian Langford, the veteran CEO, was ousted and replaced by his 28-year-old daughter, Eleanor Langford. But sources close to the family and the board are now coming forward with disturbing allegations regarding the new CEO's fitness to lead." The screen flashed to a massive, bold headline from the Manhattan Chronicle, the city's most read financial paper. "The accidental heiress. Is Langford's new CEO cognitively impaired?" The air was sucked entirely out of the room. I stopped breathing. According to anonymous sources within the Langford family's inner circle, the anchor read, "Eleanor Langford suffers from severe cognitive limitations and learning disabilities, specifically profound dyslexia, which kept her relegated to an entry-level clerical position for years. Sources claim she manipulated an elderly family member into signing over controlling shares, effectively staging a corporate coup. With the company's largest project now paralyzed, shareholders are demanding to know, has a multi-million-dollar empire been handed to someone incapable of reading her own contracts?" I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. Sources within the family's inner circle. My father hadn't just attacked the company. He had weaponized my medical history. The secret they had shamed me for, the diagnosis they had used to lock me in the shadows, they had dragged it into the blinding light of the national press to humiliate me. It was a brilliant, evil strategy. In the cutthroat world of corporate finance, vulnerability is blood in the water. Investors didn't care about family drama, they cared about competence. And my father had just painted me as a mentally deficient usurper steering a billion-dollar ship straight into an iceberg. My phone vibrated on the desk. Then my office line rang. Then Catherine's phone started buzzing. "The board members are panicking," Catherine said, looking at her screen. "2 of the major institutional investors are threatening to dump their shares by noon if we don't issue a statement. The stock is in free fall, Eleanor." For a terrifying, suffocating moment, the old Eleanor, the terrified 7-year-old girl who couldn't read the chalkboard, clawed her way to the surface. My hands started to shake. The walls of the massive executive suite felt like they were closing in. "They were right," a tiny, toxic voice whispered in my head. "You don't belong here. You are just a girl from the copy room. You are going to destroy Grandma Beatrice's legacy." The office doors swung open again. Julian Hayes walked in. He was wearing a pristine navy suit, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos erupting outside my office walls. He looked at the television, then at Catherine, and finally at me. His face was arranged in a mask of deep, manufactured sympathy. "Eleanor," Julian sighed, shaking his head. "I am so incredibly sorry. I tried to warn the board that the transition was too sudden, but I never expected the media to be this vicious. It's a bloodbath out there." Catherine's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Get out, Julian. We are managing a crisis." "With all due respect, Catherine, you aren't managing anything. You are sinking with the ship," Julian said smoothly, stepping further into the room. He approached my desk and pulled a thick, legally bound document from his briefcase. He placed it gently on my desk. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight. "A lifeline," Julian said softly. He looked at me with the patronizing pity of a wolf cornering a wounded deer. "Eleanor, you have to look at reality. The city won't reinstate those permits while you are in this chair. The investors are pulling their capital. The media is tearing your personal life to shreds. By Friday, this company will be in receivership, and your grandmother's legacy will be sold off for scrap." He tapped the document. "I represent a private equity consortium. We are willing to step in and buy your 52% right now. Today. We will assume the Chase Manhattan debt. We will deal with the city. We will take the target off your back." I looked down at the contract. My dyslexic brain didn't need to read the fine print to understand the structure of his offer. "You're offering 12 cents on the dollar," I said, the shock slowly burning away, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. "I am offering you an escape," Julian corrected, his tone hardening just a fraction. "Take the money, Eleanor. It's enough for you to live quietly, comfortably, out of the public eye. Go back to a normal life, before the stress of this destroys you, before you prove your father right." "Before you prove your father right." The words echoed in the room. And suddenly, the puzzle pieces snapped into place. I looked at Julian Hayes. Really looked at him. I saw the imperceptible smirk hiding at the corner of his mouth. I saw the extreme speed with which he had produced a fully drafted multi-million-dollar buyout contract, a document that would take weeks of legal preparation to write. He had it ready, because he knew the crash was coming. He knew the crash was coming because he had engineered it. The panic inside my chest instantly evaporated, replaced by an absolute freezing calm. The architect in my mind woke up, looking at the structural integrity of Julian's trap. The permits, the media leak, the immediate lowball offer. It was too perfectly timed. It was a coordinated demolition, and Julian Hayes was standing right in the center of the blast radius, holding the detonator. I slowly picked up the buyout contract. Julian's eyes gleamed with anticipated victory. I looked him dead in the eye, and I tore the contract in half. Julian's smirk vanished. His posture stiffened. I tore the thick stack of paper again, letting the shredded pieces fall like snow onto the polished surface of my desk. "Eleanor," Catherine warned softly, though a flicker of fierce pride danced in her eyes. "You think you understand how my mind works, Julian?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You read a hit piece in the paper and decided I was stupid. You thought I would panic. You thought I would run." "You are being irrational," Julian snapped, his polished facade cracking. "The stock is dropping as we speak. You have no leverage, you arrogant little—" "I have 52%, I interrupted, stepping around the desk until I was inches from him. "Which means I am the majority owner of the ground you are standing on. You coordinated the permit revocation with my father. You leaked my medical history to the press. You set the house on fire so you could charge me for the water." Julian's eyes widened slightly, a microscopic tell that I had hit the bullseye, but he quickly recovered, sneering down at me. "Prove it. You have nothing but paranoid delusions, and by tomorrow morning, you won't even have a company. When the board meets at 5 p.m. today, they will beg me to force you out." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the office, the glass doors rattling in their frames. The room fell silent, save for the frantic voice of the news anchor still playing on the television. Catherine let out a long, slow breath. "Well, you just declared war on a billionaire private equity shark. And he is right about one thing, Eleanor. The board is meeting at 5 p.m. The older members are loyal to Beatrice, but they are terrified of losing their pensions. If you don't have a miracle by sunset, they will vote to strip your executive powers and accept his buyout to save themselves." I turned away from the door and walked slowly toward the massive glass whiteboards covering the walls. I looked at the intricate web of Langford Enterprises. Julian thought he was the smartest person in the room. My father thought he had finally broken me, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had attacked me using the very systems my grandmother had taught me to read. Catherine, I said, my eyes scanning a specific corporate structure I had drawn in blue marker 3 nights ago. A structure Beatrice had set up decades before my father ever took power. Yes? She asked, walking up behind me. Call Harrison Vance, I said, picking up a black dry erase marker. I drew a heavy, thick circle around the name of the Sinclair Family Trust. Tell him to bring the original founding charter of Langford Enterprises to the 5 p.m. board meeting, specifically the addendum Beatrice drafted in 1985. Catherine frowned, reading the whiteboard. 1985? What is in the 1985 charter? I turned to look at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. The Sunset Clause, I replied. Julian Hayes wants to steal my grandmother's empire? Fine. Let's see how much he likes it when I turn the empire to dust in his hands. By 4:55 p.m., the sky outside the 42nd floor windows had turned a bruised, stormy purple. The Manhattan skyline was beginning to light up, but inside the boardroom of Langford Enterprises, the atmosphere was dark, suffocating, and thick with panic. I sat at the head of the polished walnut table. To my left, Catherine Sterling sat with perfect posture, her hands folded over a leather portfolio. To my right stood Harrison Vance, his worn briefcase resting on the carpet beside him. The rest of the board members looked as though they were attending a funeral, and in a way, they were. The stock had closed down 18%. The financial news networks had spent the entire day dissecting my medical history and my supposed incompetence. At exactly 5 p.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Julian Hayes strode in. He wasn't alone. Walking half a step behind him, looking simultaneously exhausted and fiercely vindicated, was my father, Maximilian Langford. Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. Maximilian has no business in this room, Julian. He was voted out. Maximilian is here at my request, Julian replied smoothly, taking his seat near the center of the table. He gestured for my father to sit in one of the gallery chairs against the wall. As the representative of the Vanguard Hayes Private Equity Consortium, I have brought him on as a senior consultant to help navigate the catastrophic damage done to this company today. We need someone who actually knows how to lead. My father crossed his legs, a smug, venomous smile playing on his lips as he looked at me. I told you so, his eyes seemed to say. You are nothing without me. I didn't react. I kept my face as still as a frozen lake. Let's dispense with the formalities, Julian announced to the terrified board, leaning forward and placing his hands flat on the table. We all know why we are here. Langford Enterprises is in a death spiral. The waterfront permits are gone. Institutional investors are fleeing. The market has zero confidence in the current chief executive, and quite frankly, neither do we. Eleanor Langford's appointment has proven to be an existential threat to this company's survival. A few of the older board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. They were loyal to my grandmother, but they were terrified of losing their own fortunes. However, Julian continued, his voice softening into that of a benevolent savior, my consortium is prepared to offer a lifeline. We will execute an immediate buyout of Eleanor's 52% at a distressed valuation of $40 million. We will inject immediate liquidity to cover the Chase Manhattan balloon payment, and we will reinstate Maximilian to an advisory board to restore market confidence. But the board must vote to compel the sale immediately, citing gross negligence and fiduciary breach on Eleanor's part. Julian looked down the table at me, his smile dripping with malice. It's over, Eleanor. Take the buyout. Walk away with $40 million. It's more money than a girl from the copy room will ever see in her lifetime. If you fight this, the board will vote to strip your executive powers, tie you up in litigation for a decade, and you will walk away with absolutely nothing. Silence hung heavily in the room. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a judge's gavel. Is there a second to the motion to compel the sale? Julian asked the room. A trembling hand slowly went up. It was Arthur, one of the oldest directors. I'm sorry, Eleanor, he whispered, but the stock. We have to stop the bleeding. My father leaned back in his chair against the wall, crossing his arms. The victory was written all over his face. He had won. He had used my disability to destroy my credibility, and now he was getting his empire back. Before we vote, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a diamond blade. I stood up slowly. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at the board members who had betrayed me. I looked dead at Julian Hayes. You orchestrated a masterpiece today, Julian? I began, my tone conversational, almost admiring. You convinced my father to use his municipal contacts to illegally revoke our own waterfront permits. Then you leaked my medical records to the press to create a panic. You manufactured a crisis so you could swoop in and buy my grandmother's legacy for pennies. Those are defamatory allegations, Julian snapped, his eyes narrowing. You have no proof. I don't need proof, I replied smoothly, because I don't care about the stock price. Julian frowned. The board members exchanged confused glances. You see, Julian, you and my father both suffer from the exact same fatal flaw, I said, walking slowly down the length of the table. You look at numbers on a screen. You look at public perception. You look at the paint on the walls. But I have severe dyslexia. I can't read the ticker tape very well. So instead of looking at the stock, I looked at the foundation. I stopped right behind Julian's chair. Harrison, I said, not taking my eyes off the back of Julian's head, would you please distribute the 1985 Founding Charter, specifically Article 9? Harrison Vance unlatched his briefcase. He pulled out 12 copies of a thick, yellowed legal document and began sliding them down the table to the board members. When my grandmother, Beatrice Sinclair, took this company public in 1985, I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority, she knew the risks. She knew that one day, Wall Street sharks might try to circle her life's work. She knew a hostile board might try to force her, or her heir, out of the company using manufactured panic. Julian picked up the document. His eyes scanned the page, and for the first time since I had met him, the smug confidence on his face began to fracture. My grandmother didn't just build a real estate firm, Julian. She built a fortress, and she installed a kill switch, I said softly. What is this? My father demanded from the gallery, standing up, his voice lacing with sudden panic. What did you give them? It's called the Sunset Clause, Harrison Vance answered from the head of the table, his deep voice ringing with profound satisfaction. A legally binding, irrevocable poison pill baked into the DNA of Langford Enterprises. I walked back to my seat, turning to face the entire room. Under Article 9 of the Founding Charter, I declared, if a hostile entity, or a faction of the board attempts to force the sale of the founder's majority shares against the will of the designated Sinclair heir, the heir is granted unilateral, unchallengeable authority to trigger the Sunset Clause. And what exactly does that do? Arthur asked, his hand shaking as he held the yellowed paper. I looked directly at Julian Hayes. It dissolves the public corporation, I stated. The room gasped. My father's jaw dropped. As of 4:50 p.m. this afternoon, I continued, my voice cold and precise, I signed the paperwork with the state of New York. Langford Enterprises is no longer a publicly traded company. All core real estate assets, all intellectual property, and all liquid capital have been legally transferred and rolled into the Sinclair Private Family Trust, a trust of which I am the sole, absolute trustee. You can't do that, Julian shouted, leaping to his feet, his face turning a mottled, furious red. That is illegal. You can't just take the assets private without a board vote. I didn't need a board vote, Julian. The charter superseded the board 40 years ago. I fired back, my voice rising to dominate the room. You spent millions shorting our stock today. You spent the entire day destroying the public valuation of Langford Enterprises. Congratulations. You successfully crashed a shell company. I gestured to the television screen mounted on the wall, which was still showing the plummeted stock price. The public shares you hold, the shares you thought gave you leverage, they are now tied to a hollowed-out corporate entity that holds zero assets, I explained, watching the horrifying realization wash over Julian's face. Your shares are worthless. Your hostile takeover targets nothing. You didn't buy a castle, Julian. You bought the dirt outside the moat. And Julian Hayes stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. The brilliant, predatory venture capitalist had just been completely, utterly, financially gutted. I turned my gaze to my father. He was standing frozen against the wall, his face pale, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. And you, Maximilian, I said, the finality of the moment settling heavily in my chest. You burned down your own waterfront permits to help him. You humiliated me in the press. You thought I was too stupid to understand the game, but you forgot that while you were busy trying to look like a king, I was in the copy room, reading the actual blueprints of the empire. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the walnut table. Langford Enterprises is dead, I announced. The Sinclair Trust now owns everything, and the board of the public shell company is officially dissolved. You no longer have seats, you no longer have power, and you no longer have access to this building. Catherine Sterling stood up. A slow, radiant, terrifying smile broke across her face. She closed her leather portfolio with a sharp snap. Well played, Eleanor, Catherine whispered. She looked at Julian and Maximilian. I suggest you both call your lawyers. The SEC is going to have a field day with the insider trading you executed to pull this stunt. Julian didn't say a word. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who had just lost hundreds of millions of dollars of his investors' money. He grabbed his briefcase, shoved past my father, and practically ran out of the boardroom. My father didn't move. He stared at me, the reality of his absolute ruin finally breaking him. He had no company. He had no legacy. He had no Vanguard merger. He had nothing. Eleanor, he croaked, taking a weak step toward me. Eleanor, please. I am your father. I looked at the man who had called me a defective asset in front of 300 people. I felt no anger anymore. I felt no sadness. I just felt an overwhelming sense of peace. You aren't my father, Maximilian, I said quietly. You were just a bad tenant in my grandmother's house, and your lease is up. I nodded to the security guards waiting outside the glass. Escort Mr. Langford to the street. He is trespassing. 3 months later, the autumn air in Manhattan was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of turning leaves and cooling concrete. The dust from the boardroom slaughter had finally settled. The media cycle, which had been so eager to devour my reputation, was forced to pivot. When the filings became public and the financial world realized that the cognitively impaired daughter had successfully executed the most brilliant corporate maneuver of the decade, taking a billion-dollar empire private and legally shielding it from a hostile takeover, the narrative shifted. I was no longer a tragic headline. I was the architect of the Sinclair Trust. Catherine Sterling stayed on as my primary advisor, and Harrison Vance became the head of our internal legal division. Together, we paid off the Chase Manhattan debt, reinstated the waterfront permits with a new, transparent environmental protocol, and began building projects that my grandmother would have actually been proud of. But fixing the company was only half the battle. The harder part was fixing the wreckage of my own life. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was sitting at a small corner table in a quiet cafe overlooking Central Park. I had requested this meeting, choosing a neutral public location. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and my mother, Lavinia Langford, walked in. She looked exactly the same as she had at the graduation gala. Impeccably dressed in a tailored cashmere coat, a string of perfect pearls resting against her collarbone. But the energy around her had fundamentally shifted. The arrogant, untouchable aura of the billionaire CEO's wife was gone. Without my father's corporate credit cards and his stolen power, the social elite of the city had quietly, ruthlessly cut her out of their inner circles. She spotted me and walked over, offering a fragile, practiced smile. She sat down, carefully setting her designer handbag on the empty chair beside her. Eleanor, she said softly, reaching across the small table as if to touch my hand. You look beautiful. You look powerful. I didn't reach back. I simply held my cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into my palms. Hello, Lavinia. She flinched slightly at the use of her first name, but she quickly recovered, her eyes filling with bright, glistening tears. I have missed you so much, she whispered, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. The house is so empty now. Your father and I are separating. He is facing the SEC investigations, and I simply couldn't stay. It's been a nightmare, Eleanor. But through it all, I just kept thinking about you. I kept thinking about how proud I am of what you've accomplished. I took a slow sip of my tea, studying the woman sitting across from me. For 28 years, I would have given absolutely anything to hear her say those words. I would have traded my soul for my mother to look at me with pride. But sitting there now, I felt nothing but a profound, quiet clarity. You aren't proud of me, Mother, I said evenly. You are just drawn to the winning side, and right now, I am the one holding the checkbook. That is terribly unfair, she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. I am your mother. Yes, mistakes were made. Yes, your father was harsh, but we were under so much pressure, Eleanor. We were trying to protect the family image. I was trying to protect you from expectations you couldn't meet. You didn't protect me. I corrected her, my voice low and completely devoid of anger. You erased me. You let him call me defective in front of 300 people, and you stared at the tablecloth. You watched him strip away my worth, and you didn't say a single word because your country club memberships and your gala invitations mattered more to you than your daughter. A tear slipped down her perfectly powdered cheek. I'm sorry. I truly am, but we are family, Eleanor. We have to forgive each other. We can start over. I want to be part of your life again. I looked out the window at the golden leaves falling in the park. My grandmother had taught me how to read the structure of a contract, but the hardest lesson I had to learn on my own was how to read the structure of an apology. Lavinia wasn't apologizing for the pain she caused me. She was apologizing because she had lost her access to power. I forgive you, I said softly, turning back to look her in the eye. Relief washed over her face. She smiled, reaching out again. Oh, Eleanor, But I am not letting you back in, I interrupted, my voice dropping like a heavy iron gate between us. Her smile froze. What? Forgiveness means I am no longer carrying the anger. It means I am not going to spend the rest of my life wishing you were the mother you are fundamentally incapable of being, I explained, my tone steady and absolute. But forgiveness does not mean access. You broke my trust every single day for 2 decades. That cannot be repaired over a cup of coffee. Eleanor, please. You can't just cut your own mother out of your life, she pleaded, the polished facade finally cracking into real panic. I can, I said simply. And I am. I will ensure your basic living expenses are covered through a blind trust so you are never on the street. But we are not going to have Sunday dinners. You will not have access to my home, my office, or my peace of mind. I might see you once a year at a holiday, if I feel like it. But you are no longer my family, Lavinia. You are just a relative. I stood up, pulling my coat over my shoulders. She sat there, stunned into absolute silence, realizing that the daughter she had treated like a ghost had finally learned how to walk right through her. Goodbye, Mother, I said, and I walked out of the cafe, stepping into the crisp autumn air. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in my entire life, my lungs felt completely full. A week later, I had one final loose end to tie up. I was walking out of the Langford Tower lobby when I saw her standing on the sidewalk. Ophelia. She was not wearing a designer silk suit. She was wearing a plain, practical wool coat, carrying a canvas tote bag filled with heavy law textbooks. The Vanguard heir had broken off their engagement the day the media scandal hit. Without my father's stolen money to fund her extravagant lifestyle or buy her a fake executive title, Ophelia had been forced to face the real world. She saw me walking toward my waiting car and stiffened. She looked exhausted. The heavy burden of being the golden child, of having to perform perfectly to earn love, had finally crushed her. We stopped a few feet apart on the busy Manhattan sidewalk. Eleanor, she said, her voice tight. Ophelia. I assume you're going to have security throw me off the sidewalk now? She asked, a bitter, defensive edge to her tone. Or maybe you want to publicly announce my bar exam scores to the passing traffic? I looked at my younger sister. I thought about the nights I used to watch her through the crack in her door, reciting laws until she cried from exhaustion just to make our father smile. We were both victims of the exact same toxic system. He just starved me while he overfed her. No, I said quietly. I'm not going to do that. She frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes. Why not? You won. You ruined Dad. You took the empire. Why aren't you trying to ruin me? Because I don't think about you enough to want to ruin you, Ophelia, I said honestly. She flinched as if I had struck her. It was the hardest truth she had to swallow, that she was no longer the center of the universe. You spent your whole life trying to be perfect for a man who only loved what you could do for his bank account, I continued, my voice softening just a fraction. Now he's gone. You're broke. You're carrying textbooks, which means, for the first time in your life, you actually have a chance to figure out who you are when you aren't performing for an audience. Ophelia looked down at her heavy tote bag. Her shoulders slumped. I have to retake the bar in February. I'm taking a prep course. I'm paying for it by working as a paralegal at a mid-tier firm. Good, I nodded. It's honest work. Do it well. I didn't offer her a job. I didn't offer to pay for her prep course. To hand her an easy way out would only trap her in the same cycle of dependency our father had created. Are we ever going to be sisters? She asked quietly, not looking up. I don't know, I replied. Maybe someday when we both figure out who we are outside of that house, but not today. Build your own life, Ophelia. I'm building mine. I turned and got into my car. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back one last time. Ophelia was adjusting the strap of her heavy bag, walking down the street, blending into the crowd of millions of other New Yorkers just trying to make a living. When I returned to the 42nd floor of the tower, the executive suite was quiet. The sun was setting, casting a brilliant, fiery glow over the city skyline. I walked behind my desk. Where my father's massive, imposing portrait used to hang, there was now a beautiful framed photograph of my grandmother, Beatrice Sinclair. She was smiling, her eyes bright and fierce. I looked at the glass whiteboards covering the walls, still filled with my architectural diagrams of the company's financial structures. For decades, the world had told me my mind was broken. The letters danced, the words blurred. The traditional paths of learning were closed to me, and my family had used that to lock me in the dark. They convinced me that my worth was defined by their inability to see it. But sitting in the chairman's seat of a multi-million-dollar trust, I finally understood the truth. Sometimes, the people who underestimate you aren't pointing out your weakness. They are simply blind to your strength. My dyslexia wasn't a tragedy. It was the exact tool I needed to see through the lies of my father's empire. I couldn't read the script they wrote for me, so I had to build a new stage entirely. If there is anything you take away from my story, let it be this. Do not let the people who broke you tell you how to put yourself back together. You do not owe your abusers your presence, and you do not owe toxic family members a seat at your table just because you share a bloodline. True power isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. It is about removing their access to your life and realizing that you were always the architect of your own worth. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If this resonated with you, if you've ever had to build your own boundaries or walk away from a toxic situation to protect your peace, please leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, truth, and taking back your power, please click that subscribe button. It means the world to me. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.